A few weeks ago, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu sat down with 60 Minutes and told the world that he wants to end American military funding to Israel. Draw it down to zero, he said, within a decade.
I want to draw down to zero the American financial support, the financial component of the military cooperation that we have.
That interview aired on May 10th. 3 days later, the Armed Services Committee quietly released the 2027 National Defense Authorization Act. Buried on page 8, in a 500-page document most Americans will never read, is Section 224. It's called the United States-Israel Defense Technology Cooperation Initiative. And it would do the exact opposite of what Netanyahu promised. The National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, is the annual military budget bill. Voting against it means voting against troop pay and military readiness. So in practice, it always passes. In fact, it's passed every year for 62 years straight. Section 224 requires the Secretary of Defense, now unofficially called the Secretary of War under Trump, to designate, quote, an executive agent responsible for synchronizing cooperative efforts between the United States and Israel, including bilateral defense technology research, development, testing, evaluation, integration, and industrial cooperation. In plain English, a permanent official inside the Pentagon whose entire job is to weave the U.S. and Israeli militaries together, not to evaluate the relationship, not to oversee it, to advance it. The companion bipartisan Senate bill, the so-called Futures Act, spells out what that means. Joint R&D at the earliest stage of weapon design, co-production facilities on American soil, licensing agreements with Israeli defense companies, and, quote, network integration and data fusion, meaning U.S. and Israeli military data systems become interlinked. The technology domains in question, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, autonomous weapons, directed energy, cyber warfare, biotechnology, every cutting-edge domain of modern warfare. And then, a catch-all clause. Other emerging technologies as jointly agreed by the United States and Israel. Other emerging technologies as jointly agreed, that's not a limit, that's a blank check. The funding baseline? $150 million a year for 3 years. $450 million on the cover sheet. The real money flows through the Pentagon R&D budgets and acquisition programs that will never be labeled as aid to Israel. Section 224 didn't appear out of nowhere. It is the latest step in a deliberate multi-year effort to deepen U.S.-Israeli military ties. The 2026 NDAA passed just 6 months ago, already included under the heading Defending Israel, a directive to study integrating Israel into the National Technology and Industrial Base, or NTIB. That's the legal framework currently limited to the United States, UK, Australia, and Canada. Membership effectively brings a country inside the US defense industrial system. 2026 NDAA also put $500 million into US-Israel missile defense, and it directed the Pentagon to refuse to attend international defense exhibitions that exclude Israeli companies. Basically, the US is boycotting international defense events to protect Israeli access. Who drove those provisions? Well, AIPAC issued a press release commending them. JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, publicly took credit for the provision, stating it, quote, aligned with recommendations in JINSA's trailblazing report. So the pro-Israel lobby think tank writes the report, the pro-Israel lobby lobbies, and the provision appears in the must-pass defense bill. That's been the pattern for years, and Section 224 is where that pattern has led to. But here's what most people don't realize about direct military aid to Israel. Right now, it's a visible line item, $3.8 billion a year. It goes through the Foreign Assistance Act, the Arms Control Act, and a law called the Leahy Law that prohibits sending weapons to military units credibly linked to human rights violations, a standard that by any honest reading should apply to several Israeli military units. Every year, Congress takes a vote. That vote has now become politically uncomfortable. In April, 13 centrist Democrats, including Cory Booker, who has been one of the most reliable pro-Israel senators in Washington, voted with Bernie Sanders on arms restrictions to Israel. The politics are shifting. But Section 224 is designed to make that shift irrelevant. Under Section 224, joint R&D gets funded inside the Pentagon's own R&D budget, not labeled as aid. Co-production facilities are American industrial investments. Licensing deals are commercial transactions. None of it says aid to Israel. None of it is reachable through the foreign aid process. And the Leahy Law is only formally inapplicable to procurement programs. A future Congress that wanted to condition support on Israel's compliance with international humanitarian law would have nothing left to grab. Now back to that 60 Minutes interview. Netanyahu told CBS anchor Major Garrett he wants to reduce American military funding to zero. Time for Israel to wean itself from U.S. support, he said.
Because we receive $3.8 billion a year. And I think that it's time that we weaned ourselves from the remaining military support.
Can you give me a timetable?
I said, let's start now and do it over the next decade, over the next 10 years. But I want to start now. I don't want to wait.
But 3 days after that CBS broadcast, the House Armed Services Committee dropped Section 224, a bill that would make separating the two militaries more structurally difficult than at any point in the history of the relationship. So which is it? Is Israel weaning itself off U.S. support? Or is Congress fusing the two militaries in ways that would make separation more expensive and more politically difficult than ever? Those two things can't both be true, and it's worth asking who actually controls this agenda. Because the answer isn't Netanyahu. The answer is the institutions in Washington that have been building toward Section 224 for years, regardless of what the Israeli Prime Minister tells CBS News. Section 224 operates at the intersection of three overlapping structures: a pro-Israel lobby that has systematically shaped U.S. defense legislation for decades, a network of billionaire donors with documented ties to Israeli military operations, and technology companies already embedded inside both militaries. So let's talk about those technology companies. In January 2024, Palantir signed what it called a strategic partnership with Israel's Ministry of Defense, explicitly for, quote, war-related missions. Investigative analysis confirmed Palantir's AI platform, the same one powering the U.S. Pentagon's Project Maven, acts as the central nervous system of Israeli military targeting by consuming drone feeds, intercepted communications, and intelligence reports to automate kill decisions. UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese found reasonable grounds to believe Palantir powered three IDF AI targeting systems: Lavender, Gospel, and one called Where's Daddy. These systems automatically generated kill lists of tens of thousands of Palestinians. They tracked people in real time, and when the target entered their family home, the system flagged it as a strike opportunity. The result? The people targeted are killed alongside their family and everyone else in the buildings. The same technology sold to both the IDF and the Pentagon under a CEO publicly vocal in support of Israel's military operations. Now, let's talk about Oracle. Larry Ellison opened a government cloud data center in Jerusalem in 2021, the first multinational tech company operating in the occupied territories, under a $319 million Israeli government contract. A 4-year classified project with the Israeli Air Force, called Project Menta, was later revealed through internal Slack messages obtained by The Intercept. Ellison has donated over $26 million to Friends of the IDF, hosted Netanyahu at his private Hawaiian island, and even is named as a potential witness in Netanyahu's domestic bribery trial. By mid-2025, Palantir and Oracle jointly launched development guides for their platforms running on Oracle's sovereign military clouds. For this specific use case, powering military AI, they now function as a single integrated system. And they're not alone. Project Nimbus, a $1.2 billion contract between the Israeli government, Google, and Amazon Web Services, provides AI infrastructure directly to Israeli military agencies. Microsoft built a custom Azure system hosting Israeli military surveillance data, including approximately 200 million hours of Palestinian phone calls. Section 224 mandates joint AI development, data fusion, and co-production partnerships between U.S. and Israeli industry. These are the companies doing that work. This legislation doesn't create the relationship, it launders it. It moves it inside the U.S. defense acquisition system, gives it permanent budget authority, and makes it structurally irreversible. This isn't all a conspiracy, it's a documented structural relationship. And when the CEO providing the cloud infrastructure to the Israeli Air Force has a 30-year personal friendship with the Israeli Prime Minister and $26 million in IDF donations, the phrase defense technology cooperation is not neutral. Section 224 is not an isolated example of Congress moving in the opposite direction of the American public on Israel. It's part of a pattern. In May 2024, Republican representatives Guy Reschenthaler and Max Miller introduced House Bill 8445 in the 118th Congress. Its purpose? To extend the legal and financial protections of the Service Members Civil Relief Act and the Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act to Americans who chose to join not the U.S. military, but the Israeli military. This would extend protection against home foreclosure. It would allow for capped loan rates and guarantee reemployment to Americans who served in the IDF. Now, this bill did not pass, but sitting members of Congress introduced it and pushed it for it to become law. That tells you exactly how far some in Washington are willing to go for Israel. Pair that with Section 224. One bill sought to protect Americans who fought for Israel's military as if they fought for the U.S. military. The other permanently fuses American military R&D with Israel's. Both bills from the same political ecosystem, both reflecting the same prioritization. Here's the political backdrop for all of it. In April 2026, from Pew Research, 60% of Americans hold an unfavorable view of Israel. That's nearly tripled since before the atrocities in Gaza. 80% of Democrats, that's up 53% from 2022. And a New York Times Siena poll showed 3/4 of Democratic voters oppose military and economic aid to Israel. Quinnipiac showed that 6 in 10 U.S. voters oppose sending military aid to Israel, the highest since they started asking the question. Among Republicans under 45, a majority now oppose renewing the $38 billion aid package to Israel. The American people have rendered a clear verdict on Israel. But the representatives in Congress are deliberately constructing a system designed to make sure that verdict never matters. Let's put this all into perspective. Section 224 is not a foreign aid provision. It's not a line item that says, give Israel money. And that's precisely what makes it so dangerous. What it actually is? A permanent institutional takeover. It installs a dedicated official inside the Pentagon whose sole job is to advance Israeli military integration into American weapons programs. It pulls Israeli partnerships into the earliest stages of U.S. weapons development, meaning Israel helps decide what America builds before a single dollar is appropriated. It plants co-production facilities on American soil, employing American workers, turning congressional districts into constituencies that can never vote against Israeli interests without voting against their own jobs. And it routes every dollar of that support through procurement and acquisition channels, with no foreign aid oversight, no Leahy law, and no annual congressional vote. Ben Freeman at Responsible Statecraft called it exactly what it is. Quote, a shift from a visible annual aid vote into the OPEC machinery of defense acquisition, where oversight is limited and political accountability is minimal. That's exactly what the pro-Israel forces in the United States are trying to achieve. AIPAC celebrated these provisions. The Jewish Institute for National Security of America took credit for writing them. Palantir, Oracle, Amazon, Microsoft, already embedded in both militaries, already powering IDF targeting operations, are the first in line for every contract Section 224 creates. The billionaires funding the lobby are the same billionaires running those companies, and they all have documented financial ties to the Israeli state. 3 days, just 3 days after Netanyahu sat on American television and promised to end military aid to Israel, the House Armed Services Committee dropped a bill that would make separating the two militaries the most structurally difficult thing Washington has ever attempted. So the question I'd like to ask Americans is, if Congress is passing legislation that moves in the exact opposite direction of American public opinion, and that's specifically engineered to remove the mechanisms through which public opinion becomes policy, what's your voice and vote actually worth on this issue? I don't think that question is rhetorical, and most people already know what the answer is. The people building Section 224 are not confused. They are not uninformed about the polling on Israel. They know the politics are shifting, and they're building this structure right now at this moment precisely because the window to make it irreversible is closing. Once the co-production facilities exist, American workers depend on them. Once Israeli origin technology is embedded in US weapons programs, you cannot remove it without dismantling the weapons. Once the executive agent is installed at the Pentagon, the institutional momentum never stops. That's what locked in looks like, and that's what they're building. Ben Freeman at the Quincy Institute was direct. Lawmakers should reject Section 224 from the NDAA. Full stop. Whether they will is another matter. As mentioned, the NDAA has passed 62 consecutive years. Section 224 is buried on page 8 of a 500-page document. The reality is that most members of Congress will vote without reading it. The lobby that drafted the blueprint for this provision will be in the room when the vote happens, as they always are, and they will be the last ones in the building when the lights go out. This Congress is trying to integrate the US and Israeli militaries. It's on page 8 of a 500-page document, hidden in plain sight, and they are counting on you not to notice, or at the very least that you look away. Section 224 is the mechanism. The polling means nothing to them. And the structure they're building is designed to survive every election, every shift in public opinion, and every future Congress, no matter what the vast majority of the American people think. That's not democracy. That's being captured by the national interests of a foreign country.